The B-17 gunner who confessed what he saw over Berlin before D-Day. The flak burst at 25, Ruzen feet like black flowers blooming in hell, and through the plexiglass turret of my B-17 I could see Berlin burning beneath us like a wound in the earth that refused to heal. The Wright cyclone engines hammered their four-part symphony of war, vibrating through the aluminum skin and into my bones until I couldn't tell where the aircraft ended and my body began. My hands trembled on the twin .50 caliber machine guns, not from cold, though the temperature was 40 below zero, but from something I was seeing in the streets below that violated every assumption I held about human nature and the rules of warfare. Smoke rose from the city in pillars that reached toward our altitude, carrying the smell of cordite and burning buildings and something else, something organic and wrong that made my stomach turn even through the oxygen mask. The searchlight swept across our formation like the fingers of a blind giant, probing for flying fortresses to pull down into the inferno. But what terrified me wasn't the possibility of being shot down. It was the certainty that what I was witnessing in those illuminated streets would follow me home, would wake me up screaming for decades to come, would change the fundamental way I understood what human beings were capable of becoming when everything civilized had been stripped away. The intercom crackled with the voices of my crewmates, but beneath their professional calm, I could hear the same shock, the same disbelief, the same moral vertigo that comes from seeing something that wasn't supposed to exist in a world where Americans still believed wars had rules and enemies had limits. What I saw below the clouds that night was never written in any official report. If you're here, stay until the end and subscribe. Stories like this must be heard. To understand how I ended up in that turret over Berlin, you need to know about a farm outside Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where a 15-year-old boy spent his summers working corn harvest and his evenings listening to Edward R. Murrow described the London Blitz on a Philco radio that picked up signals from halfway around the world. My father worked the land, but I worked the sky, spending every clear night flat on my back in the tall grass, watching stars that seemed close enough to touch, if you could just build something tall enough to reach them. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, I was 17 and certain that the war would end before I was old enough to join it. By February 1943, I was at gunnery school in Las Vegas, learning to kill from the sky with weapons that could cut a man in half at 1,000 yards. Training was controlled violence wrapped in patriotic necessity, teaching farm boys and factory workers to operate .50 caliber machine guns with the precision of surgeons and the ruthlessness of executioners. They showed us silhouettes of German aircraft until we could identify a Messerschmitt from a Focke-Wulf in the split second it took to decide between shooting and dying. The instructors were men who had flown over Europe, who had seen B-17s explode with 10-man crews inside them, who understood that hesitation measured in milliseconds could determine whether your aircraft made it home or became another wreck scattered across the French countryside. We learned to love our guns the way other men loved women, completely, desperately, with the knowledge that our survival depended on that relationship functioning perfectly under the worst possible conditions. But nothing they taught us prepared us for the reality of the 8th Air Force in England, where the life expectancy of a bomber crew was measured in missions rather than months. When I arrived at Thorpe Abbotts in March 1944, assigned to the 100th Bombardment Group, the outfit they called the Bloody 100th for good reason, the war had evolved beyond anything our training had anticipated. The Germans weren't just defending their territory, they were fighting for the survival of their entire civilization, and that desperation had transformed them into an enemy that fought with efficiency that bordered on supernatural. Every mission was a journey into a sky filled with fighters that appeared from nowhere, flak that could shred aluminum like paper, and weather that could kill you as surely as any weapon the Wehrmacht had developed. The B-17 became our cathedral in the sky, a 10-man monastery where we practiced the religion of strategic bombing with devotion that transcended mere military duty. My crew was family in ways that blood relatives could never match. Pilot Morrison from Oregon, Navigator Thompson from Tennessee, Bombardier Jackson from Philadelphia, and 7 other men whose lives were bound to mine by physics and fate and the shared understanding that we would live or die as a unit. We developed superstitions that governed every aspect of our routine. Lucky socks that couldn't be washed, photographs that had to be touched before takeoff, prayers that had to be recited in exact sequence or the mission would end badly. The aircraft herself was alive, responding to our care and attention with reliable performance or mechanical rebellion, depending on how well we treated her between flights. The routine was brutal poetry that began before dawn and ended, if we were lucky, after sunset. Briefings at 0400 hours, where intelligence officers pointed to targets on maps that looked simple until you understood that each red circle represented hundreds of anti-aircraft guns operated by men who had been trained to kill American air crews. Breakfast that nobody could eat because fear had a way of making food taste like cardboard. Equipment checks that could mean the difference between completing the mission and becoming another crew that simply disappeared somewhere over occupied Europe. Then the waiting, the interminable minutes between climbing into the aircraft and starting engines when you had nothing to do except think about all the ways the mission could go wrong. The missions over Germany were exercises in controlled terror, flying in formations so tight that a single mistake by any pilot could bring down multiple aircraft, navigating by dead reckoning across skies filled with fighters and flak, delivering ordnance with precision that could determine the outcome of ground battles being fought hundreds of miles away. We learned to read the sky like ancient mariners read the ocean, understanding that certain cloud formations meant trouble, that particular colors in the sunrise predicted weather that could scatter formations and leave individual aircraft vulnerable to attack. The 50 caliber machine guns became extensions of my nervous system, responding to threats before my conscious mind had time to process what I was seeing. Shooting at enemy fighters required leading the target like a duck hunter, calculating speed and distance and deflection in the split second before squeezing triggers that could save my crew or waste ammunition they desperately needed. But it was the mission briefing on May 24, 1944, that changed everything. The intelligence officer was nervous, sweating despite the cool morning air, referring to classified reports that suggested something unusual was happening in Berlin. The target was a ball-bearing factory in the industrial district, routine on paper, but complicated by intelligence that indicated increased civilian movement in areas that should have been evacuated weeks earlier. Weather over the target was forecast to be clear, visibility unlimited, which meant we would see everything happening on the ground with clarity that left no room for doubt or misinterpretation. The briefing included warnings about new German fighter tactics, updated flak positions, and escape routes for crews who might be forced to bail out over enemy territory. But what they didn't tell us was that Berlin had become something more than a military target. It had become a laboratory for studying what happened to human civilization when it was pushed beyond the breaking point. The flight to the target took 3 hours and 47 minutes, crossing occupied Europe at an altitude where the curvature of the Earth was visible and the cities below looked like models in a military planning room. Our formation was tight, 324 B-17s arranged in combat boxes designed to provide mutual protection against fighter attack while maintaining bombing accuracy over the target. The intercom chatter was professional, clipped exchanges between crew positions that communicated essential information without wasting time on conversation that could interfere with combat effectiveness. But underneath the military efficiency, I could hear something else. Tension that went beyond normal mission anxiety. Nervousness that suggested our leaders knew more about what we were flying into than they had shared during the briefing. The first sign something was wrong came 50 miles outside Berlin, when we encountered German fighters that didn't behave according to any tactical doctrine we had studied. Instead of attacking our formation directly, they seemed to be herding us towards specific coordinates, using feints and positioning to influence our approach route in ways that felt deliberate, planned, purposeful, beyond simple air defense. The Luftwaffe pilots were flying with desperate precision that suggested they weren't just defending their capital, they were protecting something specific, something that required American bombers to witness whatever was happening in the streets below. The flak began at exactly 25 miles from the target, rising from the city like a black curtain designed to obscure our vision rather than destroy our aircraft, though it accomplished both purposes with efficiency that spoke of months of preparation. Berlin appeared beneath us like a vision from Dante's Inferno. But what I saw through my turret window defied every expectation I had formed about how cities died under strategic bombing. The streets weren't empty. They were filled with people moving in patterns that looked coordinated, purposeful, almost ceremonial in their precision. From 25,000 feet, individual humans looked like ants. But these ants were arranging themselves in formations that resembled military parades, except the participants weren't soldiers, but civilians. Men, women, children, moving through burning neighborhoods with discipline that belonged on drill fields rather than evacuation routes. They were gathering in open squares that should have been shelters, forming concentric circles around buildings that were obviously burning, maintaining formation despite bombs falling around them like mechanical rain. What froze my blood wasn't the destruction. I had seen cities burn before, had delivered the ordnance that started fires from England to Poland. What terrified me was the organization, the obvious planning that had gone into arranging civilian populations in patterns that served no military purpose. No evacuation strategy, no survival logic that I could comprehend. They were presenting themselves to our bombers not as victims, but as participants in something that transcended warfare and approached ritual, sacrifice, the systematic transformation of an entire population into components of a ceremony that required American witnesses to achieve its full effect. The fires burning throughout the city weren't random results of bombing. They had been set in patterns that created shapes visible from our altitude, symbols that conveyed messages I couldn't read but could feel in my bones, like warnings in a language older than civilization. The bombing run lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds, but time moved differently over those streets where humans had arranged themselves as offerings to some god that demanded witness rather than worship. Through my turret, I could see our bombs falling toward targets that had been carefully selected not just for military value, but for symbolic impact, hitting buildings that exploded in colors that shouldn't exist in nature, sending smoke into the sky that formed shapes almost recognizable, almost meaningful, almost human in their configuration. The civilians maintained their formations throughout the bombing, never breaking ranks despite explosions that should have scattered them like leaves in a hurricane. They had become part of the weapon system, components of psychological warfare that used their own destruction to communicate messages that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the primitive parts of human consciousness that understand death without needing explanation. The intercom was silent except for navigation updates and mechanical status reports, but I could feel the shock radiating from my crewmates like heat from an engine. We were witnessing something that violated the fundamental assumptions underlying strategic bombing. The belief that civilian populations were incidental to military objectives, that cities died accidentally rather than intentionally, that warfare had limits that even desperate enemies would respect. What we saw in those streets suggested that the Germans had discovered methods of resistance that transformed their own destruction into victory, using American bombing to accomplish goals that pure military defense could never achieve. They had turned Berlin into a stage for performing their own martyrdom, with our B-17s providing not destruction, but documentation of a ceremony designed to haunt American crews for the rest of their lives. If this moment shocks you the way it haunted me, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. The return flight was conducted in silence, so complete it felt like flying through a cathedral where prayer had been replaced by trauma. None of us spoke about what we had seen, not because we had been ordered to maintain secrecy, but because language didn't exist for describing the systematic transformation of an entire civilian population into components of psychological warfare. The debriefing was surreal. Intelligence officers asked routine questions about fighter activity and flak positions, recorded standard observations about bomb damage and target effectiveness, filed reports that described successful completion of mission objectives without mentioning the ceremonial arrangements of human beings that had turned strategic bombing into something approaching religious experience. The photographs taken by our reconnaissance aircraft showed destroyed buildings and damaged infrastructure, but they couldn't capture the coordination, the planning, the obvious intention behind civilian behavior that had transformed victims into participants in their own destruction. The nightmares began immediately. Every time I closed my eyes, I found myself back in that turret, staring down at streets where people arranged themselves in patterns that served no purpose, except to be witnessed, to be remembered, to be carried home by American air crews who would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand what they had seen. The images burned themselves into my memory with clarity that increased rather than diminished over time. The perfect formations of civilians walking into fire, the synchronization of their movements despite chaos falling from the sky, the obvious planning that had gone into creating spectacles designed to traumatize enemy aircrew rather than defend against enemy bombing. Sleep became impossible. Meals became tasteless, conversation became meaningless, because everything reminded me of the ceremony I had witnessed at 25, 1,000 feet over a city that had learned to die with precision, that challenged every assumption about human nature and the limits of warfare. The war ended 11 months later, but Berlin never left me. I returned to Iowa, married the girl who had waited through 3 years of bombing missions, found work that paid well enough to support a family, built a life that looked normal from the outside, but was haunted by memories of people who had chosen to participate in their own destruction rather than simply endure it. I never spoke about that May afternoon when I learned that human beings could be more terrifying than any weapon, never described the formations of civilians who had turned strategic bombing into ceremonial sacrifice, never explained why I woke up screaming about patterns in the street that spelled out messages in a language I couldn't read, but somehow understood. The decades passed. Children were born. Careers were built, retirement was earned, but the clarity of that memory only increased with age. Medical science claims that trauma fades over time, that painful experiences become less vivid as the brain develops mechanisms for protecting itself against unbearable recollection. My experience suggested the opposite, that some moments burn themselves so deeply into human consciousness that they become more real than present circumstances, more immediate than current sensation, more important than anything that comes after them. Every time I heard aircraft engines overhead, I was transported back to that turret over Berlin, watching civilian populations arrange themselves in patterns that served psychological purposes I couldn't comprehend but could never forget. The guilt was worse than the fear. We had been told we were fighting for democracy, for freedom, for the preservation of civilization against an enemy that threatened everything decent people valued. But what I saw in those streets suggested that we had become participants in something far more complex, far more morally ambiguous, far more psychologically sophisticated than simple warfare between competing political systems. The Germans had discovered methods of resistance that transformed American military superiority into American moral confusion, using their own destruction to achieve victory conditions that pure battlefield success could never accomplish. They had turned our aircraft into delivery systems for trauma that would affect American aircrew for decades after the war ended, proving that some victories could only be achieved through total defeat. The confession came in pieces, whispered to psychiatrists who couldn't understand, hinted to fellow veterans who had their own secrets to protect, written in journals that were burned before anyone could read them. How do you explain that the enemy had learned to weaponize their own destruction? How do you describe civilian populations that performed their own martyrdom with military precision? How do you confess that strategic bombing had become ceremonial participation in rituals designed to haunt the bombers rather than destroy the target? The words didn't exist. The concepts couldn't be communicated. The experience remained locked inside my consciousness like a poison that grew stronger with age rather than weaker with distance. But age brings clarity along with pain. And as my 70th birthday approached, I began to understand that some memories are too important to carry alone, too significant to die with the men who witnessed them, too meaningful to disappear into the silence that protects comfortable assumptions about warfare and human nature. What I saw over Berlin in May 1944 was more than military history. It was documentation of human adaptation to circumstances that should have been impossible to survive. Evidence of psychological evolution that challenged every belief I held about the limits of civilized behavior. Proof that warfare could become something far more complex and far more terrifying than simple conflict between armies. The truth is that we lost something over Berlin that day, something more important than aircraft or crew members or mission objectives. We lost our innocence about the nature of the enemy we were fighting, our confidence that Americans understood the rules of the war we had entered, our faith that strategic bombing was a tool for accomplishing military objectives rather than participating in psychological ceremonies designed by our enemies to transform us into carriers of trauma that would affect us for the rest of our lives. The Germans had discovered that some victories could only be achieved through total defeat, that some weapons could only be deployed through complete destruction of the people who wielded them, that some warfare required the systematic sacrifice of entire populations to achieve psychological effects that lasted decades beyond the cessation of hostilities. I never told my wife, never explained to my children, never shared with fellow veterans who had their own secrets to protect and their own memories to carry. The burden remained mine alone until tonight. Until this moment when age has finally overcome fear and the need for witness has finally overcome the desire for silence. What I saw over Berlin was supposed to remain classified, not by military regulation, but by human psychology that protects us against knowledge that would challenge our fundamental assumptions about civilization and warfare and the limits of human adaptation to impossible circumstances. If you want more stories from the men who carried the sky on their shoulders, subscribe. These memories deserve to survive.